Guys, I hope you're all having a great week so far. So this week we're going to have our final lecture on AAC. Um, Next week I will kind of do some reviewing of what we've talked about so far, since I know we've had several classes, on this topic, and I want to make sure that we're all feeling good about what we've learned. So today, kind of what we're going to talk about is vocabulary selection and then instructional strategies. Now, I know that instructional strategies through an online module might be a little bit difficult, so um, just write down any questions you have, and we will do a little review when I see you guys next week. We're also going to practice some of the strategies we talk about in class, just to make sure you guys have a good grasp on what we're talking about. So, first thing we're going to talk about is teaching a want-no response to our students. So, if you've listened to me talk enough, you know that I talk about the importance of our students' ability to have some sort of communication system. And a lot of times what we end up teaching kids is a yes-no response, okay? So if nothing else, the student has a way that they can communicate yes and no. So instead of looking at a yes response, we're going to talk about a want response and kind of the difference in the two, and why a want response may be a little bit more effective for a student to have. Now, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't also know how to say yes, but maybe teaching want is a better place to start. So first off, when a student is able to communicate want, that's telling us a lot more than a student just communicating yes. It tells us that a student wants access to an activity or to some sort of item within their environment. Now, if a student simply says yes, it might also indicate that they want an item, but it also might be that they want to comment on an item or comment on an activity. If you only teach a student to start with saying yes, they don't really have an ability to initiate a conversation. Whereas want is more of a word that will initiate further conversation with a teacher. So if a student hits want out of the blue, a teacher is going to come over and further ask them, well, what do you want? And expand on that so that they can narrow down what it is the student is trying to communicate. So that's kind of a basic reason why we teach want. Another big reason why it might be a more effective word to start with is that if we teach students to request items, when they obtain a desired item, it's going to be really reinforcing for them. And we know this, things that are highly reinforcing are highly motivating. So, for example, as opposed to teaching a student to say yes to our questions, we teach them to say want to their highly preferred item that we know that they love to access throughout the day. The student's probably going to be much more motivated to learn that skill as opposed to learning just to say yes to our questions. Again, using the word want, we can artificially arrange things in our environment, so kind of capitalize on the student's needs to create more instructional trials throughout the day. So an example might be, maybe you put the student's cup out of reach, okay? So they're thirsty, the cup is out of reach. Now they have to initiate that want communication in order to get that cup. Okay? So you can kind of just contrive different situations and scenarios in your classroom throughout the day to increase the instructional trials. We know that increasing instructional trials increases the rate in which our students are going to acquire the skill, right? More practice means better acquisition. So that's kind of the rationale behind why we teach a want response. So kind of how we do it, you would first put a large want sign in front of the student. So this can be a symbol that you use in your classroom. It could be a board maker. It could be a PEC symbol. It could be a symbol the student's already kind of familiar with. But either way, you're going to pick a symbol, you're going to stick with that symbol, and you're going to put it in front of the student. Next, you're going to show that student a highly reinforcing item. So let's say the example we're going to use in class is going to be some chocolate, right? Most students are very motivated by chocolate. I'm motivated by chocolate. You guys probably are too. So we have a want sign in front of the student. We show them a piece of chocolate, and then we ask the question, do you want this? And immediately prompt them to touch want. Okay? Now, when we are talking about our prompts, when students are first acquiring the skill, we're probably going to use a strategy that's a little bit more intrusive. So maybe most to least prompts, we're starting with a controlling prompt. Okay? So we're going to take the student's hand. Maybe we're going to partially physically guide them to touch want, and then we're going to give the student the item. Now, as the student begins to acquire the skill, obviously we're going to fade our prompt to something that's less intrusive till we hopefully get to where we ask this question, do you want this? And the student independently touches want on their own. Now, once a student has gotten pretty proficient with the skill, we're going to move the sign off to the side, and then we're going to make it smaller. So they are still able to access it. It's still there throughout the day, but they no longer have the need for it to be right in front of them in order to engage in the behavior. So after our student has gotten want, then we're going to teach the word no. So we teach them to request items first. Now we're teaching them to basically say, no, I don't want that, right? So they're going to refuse items. So similarly to our want, we put a large no sign in front of the student. Again, this can be whatever sign you decide is the sign you want to use in your classroom. A lot of people will use the universal no, the red circle with the line through it. Some people use the board maker symbol, which is the red X. We're going to show the student something that we know they don't want. Now, this is important. You really need to make sure that you know the student doesn't want the item, okay? Because we're going to prompt them when we say, do you want this? We're going to prompt them to touch no. Well, if the student actually does want the item, that's going to be confusing for them. So make sure it's an item that we know they absolutely don't want. Okay? Again, we're going to prompt them, guide them to touch no, and once they touch no, then we're going to remove the item from them. Okay? Similarly with want, we move the sign off to the side and decrease its size once the student has mastered this. So next week when we're together in class, we're actually going to practice this process with different items. We're going to practice as a group, and then we're going to have you practice with each other as being the teacher and the student, just to make sure you have a good feel for how we do this. All right, so we talked a little bit about determining content for AAC last week and how to pick vocabulary. Now, when you're having a beginning AAC system, you really need to start with things that are most reinforcing for the student and with a small selection of choices. I actually did a training this week with a local school system, and they were talking about a student who they'd recently gotten an AAC device for, and it's an iPad. I'm not totally sure which app they're using, but it sounded like it was dynamic display, so you touch one picture and it moves to another screen. And it sounded very complicated for the student, and the problem that they were having is that the student continued to want to go back to their ring of PEC symbols, which has about 10 to 12 pictures on it. The student's very familiar with. They know how to use it. They know what the symbols mean. And so basically the student has an easier response mechanism with the PEC symbols and is not motivated to use the iPad because the PEC symbols are simply easier and she knows how to use it. So one thing I talked to them about was the fact that when we're introducing a new system for a student, A, the items need to be reinforcing, and B, it needs to be manageable and easily understood by the student. If the student is confused by the process, it's going to make it that much harder for them to begin to use it. So when we're determining this content, we want to start simple. Right? So we're going to expand from items only. So we're teaching the student that if you touch lunch, your device will vocalize lunch. So then we're going to move them into more complex conversation. We're combining them to teach them to say, I want, and then I want what item. So I want to go for a walk. I want a snack. I want my drink. By doing this, we're expanding their ability to make more complex conversation. Okay? We're going to work from do you want, so asking questions, having students the ability to expand further, asking them about color, about size, so making their device have more options to where they can answer our questions as the teacher or questions coming from peers, and then their ability to see certain items and then make comments. Okay, so they have dynamic display AAC where they can see something, they go to their device, they can comment on the item, and therefore having much more complex conversation with those that are around them. But remember, we have to start simple in the beginning, and then we can move to those more complex screens where they have more choices and more options. So we're going to kind of expand on the concept that we focused on in our last online lecture, which was vocabulary selection. So when we're talking about determining our task-specific content, the best strategy in order to do this is to really go through the ecological inventory process. Now, I know some of you haven't had ecological inventory taught to you, so just kind of in a nutshell, an ecological inventory is the process that we go through by looking at environments, sub-environments, and activities in which students spend their time, working through the activities that are most common for that student, and then breaking that down to the skills that they need. Now, when we're talking about vocabulary content, we're going to go through the process the same way. So maybe we're talking about, okay, our environment is the school. Okay. Now, within our schools, we know that we have lots of sub-environments. So students might spend time in the cafeteria. They might spend time in a gen ed science class. They're going to spend time in their special ed room. They're going to spend time in the gym, art, music, playground, etc. So there's lots of different sub-environments that we have. Now within those sub-environments, students engage in different activities. Okay? So student might have center time in their classroom. They might have computers, independent work, art class, music. Okay? So within our specific activities, we then have to narrow it down. Well, what activities are we specifically working on? In which areas does that student need task-specific content? And then we're going to be a little more systematic about it. So you guys did this last week without going through the ecological inventory process, and you all did a really great job. But if you're going to think further about the tasks that you worked on last week, well, you might want to break it down to, well, what is all the expressive vocabulary used in this activity? And then include, if it's needed, receptive vocabulary, okay? So it may be that you need to teach some receptive vocabulary to students. Maybe it's a science class and the student isn't aware of all the receptive terminology that's going to be used in the class. So that's something that you might need to teach, okay? Then you're going to review and list the select targets that you have, okay? So these should be the words and phrases that are determined to be the most important for the task, okay? Now, a couple of you, some of the feedback I gave on your activity you turned in last week was that you had a little bit too much, okay? So yes, there are lots of words that you might use in art class, let's say, right? But what's the most important vocabulary that student needs? Because going back to what we've already talked about, we know that if we select too much, it's going to be overwhelming for the student. So we kind of have to find that sweet spot between we're limiting them by not giving them enough options to we're overwhelming them because they have too much. So where is an appropriate place for that student to function in regards to number of vocabulary options? And that's going to be what we need to work on. Now you may say, well, how do I figure that out? Well, a lot of that's based on the specific student, right? So if the student is one who has used AAC for a while, then you can kind of compare to, well, what does their music board look like? How many vocabulary terms do they have on that when you're creating a new board? And do something similar, okay? We know if it's a novel AAC user, we're going to start small, okay? So that task-specific content might be 3 to 4 symbols until they master that, and then we can expand. Now, when we talk about lesson-specific content, this really has to do with targeting what that student needs to be able to communicate in order to participate in a class discussion on a particular lesson. Okay? So this is something that's going to change based on what the topic is in the class. Obviously, if this student is a student who's participating in a gen ed class, it's going to be probably going to be more complex than maybe what we would have if the student is in a self-contained room. So let's say we have a student who let's say their IQ falls within the normal range, they have a physical disability, they aren't able to talk, but they are an AAC user. And so maybe they're discussing the phases of the moon in class. Well, that lesson-specific content would need to be on their AAC device so that they can actively participate in that conversation regarding the phases of the moon. Okay? So this is something that takes a lot of programming, as you might imagine, to make sure that the device is updated and the student has access to it in addition to knowing how to operate it. Now, content that's considered across the lesson would be something that they could use across a different variety of topics. So, for example, things like, could you repeat that? I don't understand. I need help. These are questions that a student might need access to no matter what the topic of the lesson is. For students that can spell, this is a great way to have an alphabet area on the device. And so the student can just simply spell out novel messages that are a little bit more specific. Maybe you wouldn't want to have on every page, but they have the ability to communicate it through a typing mechanism. Now we have non-task related communication, which is all that communication that's going to occur in a classroom, in a hallway, between individuals that's not related to the activity that's going on. So you can think about all of the types of non-task related communication that you probably have within a day. Well, think about a teenager, all the things that they might talk about that have nothing to do with science class. So this includes greetings, social interactions, conversation topics for the student. Um, you're going to want to make sure that you take into account the typical conversations that occur in that environment. So if you're working with a 15-year-old male, well, what do 15-year-old males talk about? And those are going to be the things that you're going to want to have on the student's device so that they can engage in those conversations. You want to make sure you take into consideration the specific interest of the student. So if the student is really into Georgia football, then Georgia football would be something that you would want to put on their device. You also want to make sure that there are things that are interesting to their communication partners. So who do they most frequently interact with? Well, what are those students' interests? What might they want to talk about with your student? You want to include opening and closing phrases so the student has a way to start a conversation as well as end a conversation. And then symbols that really allow a variety of functions. So ability to comment, to question, and so forth. So kind of just to go through these points real quick, you want to make sure obviously that your content is age appropriate, right? So if you have a high schooler who has a moderate intellectual disability and one of their favorite things is SpongeBob SquarePants, that's not really appropriate for them to talk about in high school, okay? Maybe something that they watch at home that their parents let them do, but not something that you want on their device, okay? Because they're not going to go up to another high schooler and talk about SpongeBob SquarePants. So how can you take that interest, maybe direct it towards something that's more appropriate and teach them that? You want to make sure you're using age-appropriate phrases. Make sure you try out the system with another person first. That's really important, right? You want to make sure that people can use it and make sure that there's a role play. So if the student asks a question and the novel student responds, do they have a way to then again respond to that individual? Okay? And then obviously you want to teach the student how to use the system and role play with them so that they really understand the dynamics of the conversation. Okay, so now we're going to kind of move into guidelines for how you teach students to communicate. So first is that you're always going to teach in a meaningful way, right? So in an actual situation, if it's an item that a student can ask for, they should never just be given it, okay? This drives me nuts when I'm in a classroom and I can see that a student needs an item and the teacher just walks over and hands it to them, right? No, we should always make the student ask for the item, okay? If the student requests it, they need access to the requested item. You pick the targets you can deliver when teaching initial communication, right? So what are the things that the student asks for a lot? Take those things, arrange the environment so that the student has to ask for them to get it, okay? This is meaningful for the student, okay? And it teaches them that I engage in this behavior. I'm then reinforced by getting the item. Secondly, instruction should occur throughout the day, okay? So that means that we don't solely work on communication when it's speech time, right? So all throughout your day, this is something that should be going on and it should be foundational throughout all the lessons that you're working on. Students should always have a means to communicate, right? So if they have an electronic device, they need a backup system because what happens if that electronic device breaks? What happens if you go swimming and on CBBT or CBI and the student can't take their device in the pool, obviously, right? So what's their backup system going to be? You need to examine and expand the communication system. So all the components of the student's communication system, what's an ongoing process of determining whether they need additional vocabulary, whether some of the phrases need to be changed, right? As the student grows and matures, are the things on their device still appropriate for them, right? So it's the device is set, it's good to go, we never change it, right? Obviously, going back to what we talked about earlier with lesson-specific content, well, if the student's working on another type of lesson, you need to change that content. How can they communicate in that lesson with the specific content they need? And then we're going to teach a student to initiate, okay? So students must be able to communicate. This includes their ability to initiate communication, not simply responding to the people around them, right? It's great that students can respond to questions, that they can engage back when a student initiates with them. But think about how important it is for them to be able to initiate with others around them, okay? And that's something that we really have to teach, especially for our kids who are AAC users. So now we're going to talk about the milieu teaching procedure. Some of you may have heard of milieu. So basically, we have what's called enhanced milieu teaching, and that has 3 different areas. So the first one is core milieu teaching procedures, which is what you see on this slide that we're going to talk about first. Then we have environmental arrangement strategies and responsive communication strategies. So we're going to talk about all of those. So within the milieu teaching procedure, this is very similar to what we talked about earlier when I was giving the example of the Hershey Kiss versus the paperclip, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to model, okay? So this is used to teach new forms of communication to students. So they don't know how to use it, we're going to teach them. So the example we're talking about here is looking at teaching a student to use a wand, right? So within modeling, the first thing we have to do, obviously, is we have to gain joint attention with the student because we're going to show them the item. If we don't have joint attention, we know that the student won't attend to the item we're showing them, which then they're obviously not going to say they want it because they don't know it's there. Okay? So we establish joint attention. The teacher is then going to model the appropriate response, right? Which is want this, point to, and the teacher points to the symbol. Okay? So I've drawn attention to the item. I've modeled this process for them. Now hopefully our student models this correctly. Okay, so they touch the symbol, and then we're going to reinforce them by giving it to them. Now if a student doesn't do it correctly, so let's say that they just sit there, they don't move, or maybe they touch their desk, they don't touch the want sign, then the teacher is going to model a correct response for them and give that student another trial. So hopefully after showing the model again, the student's going to respond correctly, and then they're going to be reinforced. Okay? If the student still responds incorrectly, the teacher is going to give a correction procedure. So we're going to deliver an intrusive prompt the student to touch the want sign, and then give it to them. The second step is teaching the manned model procedure. Okay, so this is where we're going to have interesting items that are presented to the student, right? And as the student becomes interested in the item, the teacher is going to mand, which simply means to verbally instruct the student to request the item. Okay, so let's say we're showing the student a couple of balls, and maybe there's a red ball that they're staring at, and it looks very interesting. Then the teacher is going to provide a verbal prompt in the form of a question, so which is what we did earlier, right? And say, do you want this? Go through the same process. Hopefully the student is going to then request it. So we've kind of moved from a intrusive to a little bit less of intrusive step, right? Showing the student the item, then prompting them through that. Now the third step, we're going to move kind of to a time delay, right? So the purpose for this is to teach the student to initiate, right? So up here with our first steps, we're using a very intrusive prompt. Maybe we were doing kind of a more of a maximum prompt kind of a strategy with them. Now we're moving to time delay, where we know we have that time that's inserted between our prompt and in delivering the controlling prompt to the student. So we're giving the student the option to initiate the communication. Okay, so our wait time is typically around 3 to 5 seconds, but again, that depends on the student. We know if the student requires a lot of motor planning time, we're going to give them more time. So we show them that reinforcing item. Okay, maybe it's a red shiny ball, and we wait. And hopefully the student is learning and is catching on, and they're going to initiate that they want the item. If not, then we'll deliver that controlling prompt and prompt them to request. And then fourth, so once we've kind of moved through this and our student is showing progress, we're going to look at that incidental teaching, which we've kind of already covered a little bit. So we're going to expand our language and improve our conversational skills with the student. We're going to do some of our environmental arranging, where we're going to promote initiation by putting things away that the student wants, making them request. When the student makes a request, the teacher provides a model, manned, or delay for more complicated responses if that student is struggling in that area. So environmental arrangement is exactly what it sounds like. We've already talked a good bit about this, but it's simply ways to arrange the environment to create more communication opportunities for students, right? So the more we can arrange, the more the student has to initiate and use their communication, the quicker they may learn, right? So these are kind of a list of all the different ways that you might do this. So I'll talk about a couple. So assistance, right? Maybe we give a student an item that we know they're going to need assistance with. So, you know, those milk cartons that they have at school that are so hard for kids with physical disabilities to open. Well, maybe we know they can't open it, but we give it to them anyway. Okay. So they have their milk. Well, now they have to ask for help. Okay. So this is a way to create a scenario in which the student is forced to ask for assistance if they want to drink the milk. Um, Giving them smaller portions. So maybe we have their food and we only give them a small amount of their food and they can see the rest, but they have to ask for it to get some. Um, Unexpected situations. So maybe the student puts something where it doesn't belong, right? So for example, maybe a student puts, or a teacher puts a cup on top of their head, right? Well, kids are going to probably think that's funny, right? So that's maybe a good way to teach the student to say something like that. So they're teaching them to comment on an odd situation. Okay? Environmental arrangement is a great way to work on communication skills with your students. Lastly, we're going to talk about responsive communication strategies, which was the third milieu teaching strategy. So essentially what it is it's a way to promote conversational interactions, okay? Much more advanced. So this is something that you're going to apply after a student has learned many of the concepts we've already discussed. And it really consists of 4 different areas. So the first is establishing that joint attention. So teaching students to look at the same item as another, right? And then teaching that concept of turn taking. So making communication, the length and the complexity the same for both students, teaching students to pause, right? Teaching students to respond to a question and to ask a question, right? The third area is contingent responsiveness. So the teacher responds to the student's communication attempts upon their occurrence and respond in a meaningful way that addresses the student intent, right? So the student is learning that the question that is asked, there's an appropriate way to respond to that, right? A lot of times if you watch kids with disabilities talk to each other, sometimes they'll ask a question and then the other student simply comments on something completely unrelated, right? So it's kind of teaching them not to do that and what's a positive way to respond to someone. And then fourthly, positive affect. So the teacher responds with a positive affect, teach the student to smile, to use a gentle tone with the student. So it's really working on those social interaction pieces and tying in some of that those nonverbal communication skills that go into conversation. So another strategy we're going to talk about is called the interrupted chain strategy. Okay. So again, this is a very simple way to create opportunities for conversation. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to select a familiar routine for the student. And then you're going to interrupt with a communication trial. So maybe the familiar routine is maybe the student's morning routine. So they might come in, they might take off their jacket, take off their backpack, hang it up, get out a folder to do a morning sheet, for example. So maybe they get out their folder, but there's no sheet in it. Okay, so you've interrupted that chain by the fact that something is missing from the chain. The student then needs to ask in order to receive the work that they typically have in their folder. Okay, and this can be done with a variety of things for your classroom, right? You could interrupt a chain of brushing the teeth by not having the toothpaste readily available. Okay, conversational skills training is, again, exactly what it sounds like. And this is a huge need for really all of our students who have disabilities. So not just students who are AAC users, but students who have disabilities in their classrooms as well. So this would be something I would encourage you to work into your classroom with your AAC and your non-AAC users. So essentially what you're teaching students is what's appropriate content to discuss, how do you start a conversation, how do you use appropriate turn taking? This is a huge one for our kids. And then how to finish a conversation. So students learn what an appropriate greeting might be. And this really can be tailored to the students and discussed by age, right? So you teach kids, well, the way that you greet your classmate is going to be different from the way that you greet your teacher. And teaching students those little social nuances and how to apply those. Appropriate turn taking and engaging in conversation topic that the listener wants to engage in, not something that only the student is interested in. And how do you pick up when someone's not interested in what you're trying to talk about? Okay, so all of these are strategies that you are things that you need to teach your students, and you can work in through a conversational skills training. Now, this is something that you probably would work in a specific time of your day, but also something that you want to look for those incidental opportunities to teach, right? So when a novel person comes into the room and maybe your students, maybe they don't greet them. Maybe they simply start commenting on something, right? So kind of they've started in the middle of a conversation. Well, that's a great opportunity to interrupt them, to redirect them to an appropriate greeting, and to then move on through the conversation. So be looking for those ways that you can incidentally work in these skills throughout your day. So now we're going to talk a little bit about PECS, which stands for the Picture Exchange Communication System. You guys may all be a little bit familiar with PECS. I hope that you've at least seen it, but essentially it is exactly what it sounds. It is a system in which kids exchange pictures, and it has a communicative meaning to it. So this is really considered a naturalistic teaching strategy in which the learning really occurs throughout daily routines and activities that the students are engaged in. So it has different phases that we're going to talk through. So the first phase is physical exchange. And the goal of this is to teach the student to hand the picture to the teacher, right? Typically this requires two adults. So one adult is behind the student and one is in front of the student. When the student reaches for a desired item, the adult behind the student is going to guide the student to pick up the picture and give it to the adult in front, right? So that physical exchange is being physically guided by a teacher who's behind them, guiding them to give the picture to the other adult. And then that physical assistance is going to be gradually faded away as the student learns to do this on their own. Phase two is distance and persistence, right? So the distance is increased between the student and the teacher, right? So that the student has to go to the teacher to physically hand the picture and receive the desired item. Right? So a lot of times kids are very quick to engage in a picture exchange or communication exchange if someone is right there with them, right? So once they've got that down, then we're going to have to get them, well, if the teacher's across the room, I know that I can get my PEC symbol, take it to them, and then get what I need. Phase one and two, during phases 1 and 2, the student actually has not had to attend to the picture really. So it's probably one picture that you're using for the most requested or desired item that the student has, and they're learning just with that picture right now. Now in phase 3, we're moving to discrimination training. Okay. So the student's given a picture of a highly reinforcing item and one picture of a non-preferred or irrelevant item. And then the student, the item that corresponds with the picture is what the student is given. So a lot of times you see PECs used with kids with autism, and this is where they really have to start paying attention, right? Because we know a lot of times kids with autism don't attend to what we want them to attend to. So with the discrimination training, they have to make sure they're choosing the symbol that correlates with the highly reinforcing item and not the non-preferred item. Okay? Obviously, we pair our highly preferred with a non-preferred item because it's going to increase the likelihood that they're going to learn this quicker, right? If there's something that's really non-preferred, much more motivated to pay attention and pick the correct symbol. During phase 4, this is where we have sentence structure. So we're going to combine symbols to make a sentence. So student may be taught to pick up I want and then use a sentence strip. Okay, so I want and then car, right? And they put those on a sentence strip and then the teacher can then read that. During phase 5, we're moving into actually where we're asking questions. So the teacher is initiating, what do you want? The student is responding to the question by giving the PEC symbol that they want. And then finally, we move students into commenting, which is exactly what it sounds, where students are taught to respond to what they see. So lastly, we're going to talk about breakdown strategies. So you guys have all probably been in a situation where some sort of breakdown in communication happens, right? Most of the time, it's probably because the student's communication isn't clear or the student doesn't have the vocabulary they need to communicate what they want. So when that happens, it's really important that you have strategies to figure out, well, how am I going to determine what the student is talking about? So the first strategy is to narrow the options and find a category. So this can be done by simply asking questions. So you may ask the student, are you trying to tell me something or are you trying to ask me something? Okay. So by using yes, no responses, the student is able to answer those questions until you can narrow down what is it that they're trying to do. So what's the kind of the form and the function of the communication? And then you can get to the actual topic through that same strategy. Secondly, you can clarify and verify the message, right? So, um, as you're going through, you're going to repeat what you maybe think the student is trying to say, and then ask questions. Am I close? Is that right? Is there more to what you're trying to say, for example? There's actually an example of a conversation that is clarified through these means in your textbook. It's on page 249 and 250. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And then lastly, teaching students to recognize deadlocks is very important. So it may be that the student is talking to someone and they realize that their message hasn't been understood. And sometimes for that student, they'd honestly rather just drop the conversation than continue. So that's an important thing to teach a student to differentiate. Is it a message that's important that I need to persist and make sure my message is gotten across? Or is it something that it really doesn't matter and it may just be easier for me to move on? So that's it for this week. I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your week. Make sure you write down any questions or anything that you want to further talk about when we meet in person next week, and I'll see you guys soon.